So let's discuss combat in Battalion Combat series, the various forms of combat that are available and how they work. So we've alluded to earlier what is known as a regular attack. This is units with assault arrows can attack units adjacent to them, utilizing their action rating. If we pull up the combat chart, I believe this is still not visible to you, but there's a series of modifiers here, and so there's a few important things to note for what is regular attack, normal combat. Probably the first and most important one is during an activation, a target hex can only be attacked once via regular combat. And due to the stacking limits of 2 battalions, you're pretty much looking at 1 battalion plus 1 assisting battalion attacking a single hex. So in some other war games, perhaps you might see something along these lines where you have tons of pieces piling onto a single hex and achieving 6-to-1 odds or something of that nature. And this is not how Battalion Combat Series works. You've got, generally speaking, a battalion and maybe an assist going at a single battalion next to it. Just to be clear, if you look at the combat table, you're rolling 2 dice 6. You need an 11 to achieve basically a very favorable attacker result. That the result at an 11 is the defender takes a step loss and the defender has to retreat. Below an 11, you start getting the attackers taking step losses, and the defender will have to retreat situational, and so on and so forth. I mean, so those are not terribly good results. And yeah, obviously on 2 dice 6 and 11 is certainly outside of the range of standard deviation. The basic mode of normal combat is the attack rating of the attacker versus the attack rating of the defender. The difference being a positive on the die roll. So if we were to take, for example, this 9 of the 12th of the 2nd Regiment of Confru Piper hitting the 3 of the 394th, the 99th Infantry Division, yes, the Panzer Grenadiers have a 5, and the U.S. Infantry boys here got a 3, and so that would be a +2 to the dice. But that's definitely short of the 11 that is sort of needed to achieve maximum combat damage, right? So your normal die roll on 2 dice 6 would be 7, and +2 is only 9, which is an attacker loss of 1, a D situational. I mean, it's not. So the Germans could grind their way through, but at the end of the day, right, what's really desired here for the German players to not necessarily kill these Americans, but certainly make them retreat and get the hell out of the way, so the the conf group can charge ahead, and it's not an easy task. There's an additional set of modifiers here, and we can go through them. So if either side is dual or supported, they get a +1, and so that's where Speets is one of these duels, but for shits and giggles, he's not involved in the fight, right? However, the 3 of the 394th, part of the 99th Infantry Division, is supported. There's a support unit here with the HQ. This indicates that these AT guns are scattered throughout the 99th Infantry Division, so all the battalions therein have a few of these AT guns, so they have support. So that's a +1 on the American side. The next one is MSR is blocked, marked. This is basically a -1 if you don't have supply. That doesn't apply in this case. So now we got attacker only. So suppression mission gives you a +2. So any one hex can not only be attacked in regular combat once per activation, but it can only be hit with a single arty mission per activation. And so you can drop a what's called a barrage mission into the hex, which can result in step losses, or you can use the arty points to do a suppression mission, which results in this +2 on the combat table, but no step losses. So let's assume the Germans will do that. So that gives them a +2. An assist. So if you have 2 battalions, right, attacking, one of them is the main attacker, the other one is the assist. That gives us a +1. So now we have a +3 on the German side. A double objective zone. So we kind of skipped over activation here as we're discussing combat. But for practical purposes, let's assume that we've put both of our objective markers on the 3 of the 394th of the 99th Infantry here to give us the double objective zone bonus. So now we have a +4 total for the Germans. Attacking formation has prepared defense? No. And attacking from off map? No. A shock attack, we're not doing a shock attack, so we'll ignore those. Okay, so the defender only. Prepared defense. So, yes, the 99th Infantry Division is in prepared defense. So the Americans earn themselves another +1. 2 units in the defender's hex, no. Hex side terrain. So if you're attacking across a hex side that has some beneficial benefit, right? Attacking across like a river or a stream or something to that effect, there would be a +1, but that's not the case. And we have dual or infantry, use only one. In a terrain hex is +1, or in a city hex is +2. So these guys, the 3rd of the 394th, the 99th Infantry Division, are not in a city, but they are in terrain. If you look at the terrain chart, you'll note that there's a list of terrain types here which count as terrain. It's basically kind of a binary situation. Either the terrain that you're in counts as terrain or it does not, and if so, you get the +1. So, yeah, what do we got going here? So the Germans, so the Americans were 3, +1 for support 4, +1 for prepared 5, +1 for terrain 6. The Germans are 5, +2 for support or suppression 7, assist is 8. Double objective is 9. So it's, 9 versus 6? So the differential is +3. So, Germans roll 2 dice 6, get a 9, plus 3 is 12, which is pretty good. So, we got a D1 and a D retreat. So, the 3 of the 394th, the 99th Infantry Division takes a step loss, and they have to retreat. Actually, I haven't done retreats yet, so I might have to read up on that. But that would be the result, and obviously that was a pretty good roll on the German side. So I believe retreat is something in the order of 3 hexes towards your HQ. So 1, 2, 3, say something like that. The Germans get to advance into that hex for free. And yeah, so right, Kampfgruppe Piper can continue charging down the road here and making a mess of things. So that's basically regular combat in not so many words. The next kind of combat we're going to cover is barrage or artillery. So each HQ has on its counter this inherent artillery point value. For Kampfgruppe Piper, for example, it's 1. For the 3rd Fallschirmjäger here, you note it's 3. If we take the 99th Infantry Division of the U.S., it's 4. And so, in short, as an alternative to engaging in normal combat with a hex, when you activate a formation, you can drop arty into the hex using these points. And there's also, as you'll note here, assigned artillery points. So not only does the 99th Infantry have its 4 inherent, but there's 2 additional assigned. So it's got 6 artillery points. Barrage is basically the division artillery being dropped on targets in range, and so you have battalions that are part of the division, and if they can spot, they can drop artillery. And spotting is usually a factor of the visibility range. Spotting does count as a fire event, and you can only do it in objective zones. So you can't just drop artillery willy-nilly, right? You need to spot. It needs to be in an objective zone. So if we were to assume that the U.S. 99th Infantry rolled its snafu on its activation and achieved some kind of activation, it would be able to right, theoretically it could drop an objective marker there on top of Piper, or maybe on top of those guys, or on top of those guys, and these, the 3 of the 394th, even after retreating, right, they could spot, and you could start dropping some barrage on the, what do we got here? 9 of the 12th of the 2nd Regiment, Panzer Grenadiers, Kampfgruppe Piper. If you look at the barrage table, it's pretty simple. It's 1 die 6. And you roll 1 die per unit in the target hex. This is kind of important because this discourages stacking. And you'll note, if you're not a hard unit, and you're not in city, and you're not in terrain, then you get into this all other barrage, and you're now looking at a 3 to 6 on 1 die 6, right? So you've got a 2/3 chance of taking a step loss. And if you're stacked out in the open here, basically like Speets and the 1st and 2nd of the 1st Panzer Regiment, and the enemy starts dropping arty on you, you're probably looking at taking some fairly serious step losses, and these are without risk, if you were, right? In normal combat, if you have a poor roll, right, you might take step losses, but with Barrage, right, you're just dropping arty on the guy, and you're not really in any danger. So that's Barrage. Again, this is only allowed in objective zones, and you got to be able to spot the guy. So that's that. The next kind of combat that is allowed in the system is what's known as a shock attack. This is basically a tank. Right? It's required that you have a tactical movement, so a red movement, and you got to have a red AV, or be dual, or be light AV, or be breakthrough, which is indicated by this red stripe, for example, on these Tigers on Conf Group Piper. These are all units capable of executing a shock attack. A shock attack, again, needs to be in an objective zone. Objective zones are within 2 hexes of objective markers, which are laid down by unit after a successful activation. And a shock attack is basically sort of like a normal attack, but instead of it consuming all of a unit's fire events, an armored unit could theoretically execute the shock attack and, if successful, continue to move. Most of the modifiers that apply to normal combat apply to shock attacks, as well as there's a couple of extra ones for shock attacks only if you have a breakthrough AV unit or a hard red AV unit. There's a couple more pluses. Generally speaking, a shock attack is it's only going to succeed if you've got a quite powerful armored unit against a pretty weak infantry unit. And so they're sort of situational, if you will, right? Right, so if you have a strong armored unit and you're hitting a weak infantry unit on defense, they're not dug in, etc., etc., you can probably pull it off. Otherwise, it's usually not going to do what you'd like. Next up, we have an attack by fire. So an attack by fire is AV units, right? So if you have an AV rating and you don't have an attack arrow, you actually cannot engage in hex-to-hex combat, right? You can't do a regular attack. But what you can do is you can do an attack by fire, and that uses one of these 2 fire events. Each unit gets 2 fire events per activation, And an attack by fire is basically like a barrage. So if you think about it, right, you've got the 501st Armored Battalion here of Conf Group Piper. It says Tigers. I mean, so this is basically a group of King Tigers, battalion of them. And if they wanted to do an attack by fire, they're basically going to be shelling these 254th Engineers here in Bulligan. And that's resolved on the barrage table. It's actually no different than if you dropped arty on them, and so it can inflict step losses, and that's sort of its purpose in life. Again, this has to be within an objective zone, and it uses a fire event.